Welcome to the Tom Nelson podcast. Today, I'm happy to have Michael Kelly here to talk about net zero, I believe. Michael, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself to get us going?
Sure. I'm Michael Kelly. I'm a New Zealander, and I came to Cambridge 51 years ago to do a PhD in solid state physics, and I've had a career in advanced physics for advanced devices. But for the last decade, before I retired 6 years ago from the university sector, I had a period when I was a scientific advisor for a government department in London at a time when the 2008 Climate Change Act was signed. And I started to get interested in it because the department in which I was giving advice was called Communities and Local Government. And it was the way in which central government in London interacts with all local authorities around the country. Now, it turns out that that department has all control over building codes and regulations and planning. And when you look at the situation in the UK, 45% of all the CO2 emissions in the UK come from heating air and water in buildings. So this was an example where if the government was really serious, it was in those days, about an 80% reduction in carbon emissions, then the Department for Community and Local Government should be right out in front, leading the way, because nearly half of the CO2 was coming from within their purview. This went down like a lead balloon among my colleagues because the key word in the department for many people was communities. So they felt that they were a social science department looking at cohesion of communities, poverty, racism, the integration of refugees and so on and so forth. And the idea that there should be a whole lot of work, they said, leave it to the business department or somebody else to look after retrofitting buildings. So I got quite keen on that and did a lot of work on that. But then I was introduced to another Kelly. Well, I knew him, but he was a Professor Kelly at Surrey. And he pointed out that he was quite critical of the climate change science. So I got involved then with him on some of the stuff. And to this day, I'm a critic of the climate science. I've given up arguing climate science because there are thousands of people who get paid day in and day out to think up new arguments. And I don't have time to spend my time doing that. So my main thesis today is that I'm going to allow anybody to have whatever view they like on climate change, but I'm just going to tell them a few hard truths about the realism associated with achieving net zero, which seems to be the latest mantra. I met an American friend this morning as I was going into the center of town, and he said, you know what, I think that net zero is the perfect word for a bumper sticker. And I thought that just captured, but not for anything else. And I thought that was a word of wisdom that I put into the debate here.
Very
That's
good.
my background. One other thing I think I should mention is that for the last 6 years in the Department of Engineering at Cambridge, I was asked and led the teaching on a course called Present and Future Energy Systems, which was essentially a study of how the United Kingdom is energized now and how it might be in 2050. And I must say, I had about 100 students a year, and I left them all with the fact that this was a problem of inordinate scale that nobody was actually giving anything like the attention to that it should be. And what makes this particular lecture today timely is that we are in the middle of an amazing series of political U-turns at the moment. And this is the case of some very, very right-wing economists suggesting they're going to get rid of all the treasury orthodoxy. And then there's suddenly the markets have been spooked and reacted, and they're having to rein everything in so that these radical ideas haven't survived a hard dose of reality. Now, I think that this winter in particular, with the rocketing prices of energy, is going to be yet another example where we may get a rein in on the net zero. For example, there was a letter just in the Times about 6 weeks ago where somebody was writing in saying we wouldn't have all this energy crisis in Europe if we'd gone twice as fast in installing wind farms and solar farms. wind and solar farms. And I wrote a letter in reply saying, yes, if we had gone twice as fast, the hole in which we'll be in this winter, when we have 3 weeks of no wind or sun, will be twice as deep if we've gone twice as fast, and that we must look at the whole thing in the round. So that's just a little bit of my background.
Okay, very good. Yeah. Do you have a presentation?
Is that it?
Yep, looks great. Great.
Righto. So here's the background. I'm going to assume that the United Kingdom government has set up a delivery agency to get a net zero emission economy by 2050. And furthermore, I'm going to be assumed that I've been appointed the first chief executive officer of this agency. And my first task is to undertake a scoping exercise of what's needed and report back to the directors and indeed to the relevant minister. And so this presentation is my preliminary report.
Good.
So I'm going to scope some projects that are necessary to get there. So if I wake up on the 1st of January 2050 and we have a net zero emissions economy, there'll be 3 very large projects that will have been completed between now and then. Ground transport will have been electrified, decarbonized. Heat, both commercial and domestic, will have been electrified. And the electricity sector, which is generation, transmission, and distribution, will have been greatly expanded to allow the first 2 projects. Now, these are necessary but not sufficient conditions for a net zero economy, because I've made no mention of agriculture or sea or air transport, changes in people lifestyles, extra costs of running 2 fuel transport infrastructures in parallel, electric and fossil fuel, and indeed the cost of the electric vehicles themselves. And nor have I considered the precise siting of new electrical generation. So I've left a whole lot of problems out, so that I've got a core set for which the main expertise is not economics, it's engineering. And when I give this talk, the economists say they don't like my economics. I said, this is not about economics. This is about engineering. If you want these projects done as an engineer, I'll scope them for you like any other project. Now, I've got some other underlying assumptions which people can fairly challenge. I'm going to assume we're going to have a broadly similar economy in 2050, both quantitative and qualitatively. So I'm not advocating a hair shirt future or anything like that. Changes in the population growth and then the efficiency gains, possibly of order about 10% over the 30 years, will roughly cancel each other out. Now, when I'm making these estimates, I'm talking about factors of 10. So I'm not going to be concerned about the second or third decimal point. And these are estimates, which is the starting point for policy debates. Changes in lifestyle have to be factored in afterwards. And some other assumptions will be made along the way, and I'll cite them as I get there. Now, this slide here is the most important slide for my starting point. This is a slide which shows the energy consumption in the United Kingdom over 3 years under 3 headings. The axis up on the side is terawatt hours per day, but it's just an energy consumption. And towards the bottom, we have a red-brown, which is the electricity supply. And broadly, you see it peaks in winter between year end. And even if you look closely at Christmas time, you can actually see the effect of Christmas holidays, that there's a drop in the industrial use of electricity at that point. And it peaks in winter, drops in a bit in summer. And then above it in the gray step line, you've got transport energy. And that looks to be roughly the same throughout the year, a little bit of here and up and down. And then the third one, which is in blue, is the total amount of heat energy used in the United Kingdom. And there, of course, you see the fact that there's a certain low amount in summer, which will be forms of industrial process, but it's dominated by heating air and water in buildings, particularly during winter. So that's the qualitative thing. Now I want to just say something about the new electricity supply, and it's a series of closely argued points. The first thing I want to show you to make an assertion is that the amount of transport energy we're using is roughly about twice as much as the electrical energy we're using. I think you can see that.
Yep.
Now, if I convert all of the internal combustion engines to electrical engines, the point is that electrical engines are 3 times as efficient, at over 90% efficient at using electrical energy, than internal combustion engines are at using fossil fuels. So if I take 1 as the size of the grid today, as we have it for what we use today, then I'm going to need 2/3 of a grid to provide all the electricity that will be needed to run our ground transport. So that just bringing the transport into the frame of electrification, we're going to need the grid to go from 1 to 1.7 in size. Now, the tricky bit really is the provision of heat in winter. If I decided all electrical heat would be by radiant heat, just like a 3-bar heater or that equivalent, then I'm going to need 3 times the grid, existing grid, just to provide that peak demand in winter. But I'm going to assume that everywhere we use heat pumps with a coefficient of performance of 3. That's an assumption. It's a stretch. But if we did that, then we would still need we'd need the whole of the existing grid. The whole of the existing grid as we have it now would have enough electricity, particularly at the winter time, to support all the heating we use today if it was provided by heat pumps. So the net result of staring just at this diagram is that the electrical grid and its capacity has to increase from 1 today to 2.7. 1.7 with the electrical transport, and then another 1 to 2.7. And that's enough for us to start making some estimates. By the way, here's the equivalent data for the United States. It's in a slightly different, it's the same form, but slightly different. And I want to show you it's quite different. If you look at the blue line running across the top there, that's the demand in electricity. Now, it's slightly more variable than the UK. And in particular, what I found interesting is there are 2 peaks each year, and the larger of the peaks is the summer air conditioning in the south of the US, and then there's a winter peak for the heating in the north. That's interesting in its own right. By the way, underneath it, following it in yellow there, that's the contribution of fossil fuel to the energy, to the electrical energy. So you see about 60% of all US electricity is provided by fossil fuels. So when it comes to converting, by the way, let me just come back to that point in a minute, but the gray line there is the fossil fuel heat, which again, let's have a look at peaks and that's winter, yes, 12, yeah. Peaks in winter as I'd expect. And then, but there's a high base load. So that base load that's running across will be all the industrial heat, which I'm assuming is roughly constant around the year. And then the orangey, burnt orange color there is the transport, and it too is roughly constant around the year. But the relative ratios for the UK and the US for transport and so on are slightly different. But that's the data, and I can use that, and I have used that to give some data on the US, which I'll include later on my slides. So here's just a little comment. I think I've made all those points. And I've made all those points, that's heat, yes. Now, so we've got the grid going to expand by a factor of 1.7 times. Now, before I go into looking at the cost of the electrical sector, let's just look now at the cost of expanding the sector. Atkins in this country is a major consulting engineering firm. I'm not quite sure offhand what the US equivalent would be, but it's a major, and that suggests that we have our peak consumption is just over 50 gigawatts of electricity a year, and we have something like 75 gigawatts installed capacity. Atkins suggests that if we electrify our grid along the way, I said that we'd have to expand our grid with 12 gigawatts of firm capacity. That word firm is very important because it means this has got to be a capacity which is available when and where we want it. But we're going to have to do 12 gigawatts new every year for the next 30 years, which I have to say is 8 times the average capacity investment in the UK over the last 30 years. And that investment over the last 30 years includes all the renewables in terms of offshore and onshore wind farms and solar farms. So we're not even on, we've still got a huge factor to go. Now, here's the other one, which I found really interesting in discussions. The current home in the United Kingdom has a 60 amp fuse. Now, of course, we have 240 volt electricity. I think the fuse in the US is about 90 amps, typically, in a home. And of course, your currents are rather higher because you have lower voltage. So for the same power consumption, you use more current. So in the UK, we have a 60 amp fuse, and that was set 70 years ago when a 9 amp kettle or a 12 amp stove, the cooking range, was the largest domestic appliance that was used. And the local wiring and distribution around towns and cities are all scaled by this mains fuse and how much you can get down a street and so on and so forth. Now, if you look at an all-electric house in the future, a ground source heat pump, when it's starting up for the first minute or so, draws 58 amps. A radiant hobs on the radiant elements on a hob, a stove, I don't know whether you use the same word in the US, but it's a stove in the kitchen with radiant elements. They draw 27 amps when you turn them on first while they're glowing. Fast and slow electric chargers pull out 33 or 12 amps, and an electric shower. Now, very few houses in this country have a hot water cylinder anymore. So in my house, if I want a shower, it's fired by gas, and the gas heats the water in real time so that I don't have a room or a place where I've got a hot water cylinder. If I replace a gas shower by an electric shower, I need 33 amps. So you can see in this all-electric home, the chances of drawing more than 60 amps and fusing everything is pretty high. Mm-hmm. And so it looks as though the whole of the distribution system will have to be rewired. That's all our towns, our streets, our substations, and substations to the main transmission grid. Now, that for the UK is estimated, a friend of mine has done an estimate, thinks it's about 700 billion pounds, or about 8 or 900 billion dollars. So it's not a cheap thing. And that's something which is not discussed in the general discussion of getting net zero, but that's an important point. Now, it's interesting because I happen to come originally from New Zealand. So you see, I've got a reference there to New Zealand. New Zealand is the largest city is Auckland, and it's been expanding rapidly over the last 30 years. There's been quite a lot of immigration to New Zealand. The population has gone up. It's already the case that Auckland City, in certain parts, the distribution system is already at breaking point before we even start putting any of these electric further things on. So people, for example, with electrically heated swimming pools and that sort of thing have to have three-phase mains, specially established. So there's a whole part of the cost of expanding the electricity sector about distribution, which we have to take into account. Now, this one is all just about numbers, and all it describes is how much of how many kilometers we have of our transmission system, 400 kilovolts, 11,500 kilometers, so on and so forth. And I'm going to assume somewhere between 1.7 and 2 times more is going to be needed because of that argument I had earlier. Now, the best data I can get for the capital cost of these comes from a US organization, MISO. And I've converted into pounds sterling, so it could go back to dollars. But it tells me that how much I need for the cost of transmission. And when I apply that just to the transmission lines, I get 130 billion for the United Kingdom, or up to 200 billion if we include all the controls and the transformers and everything else that we need. And then finally, there's generation. And again, as I say, we've got 75 gigawatts installed today, and we're going to need another 150 installed. And again, and this, by the way, we need to be able to meet peak demand in winter without renewables or batteries. Basically, batteries aren't anywhere near scalable at this point, and we regularly have 3 weeks in winter with neither wind nor sun, so that we'll get 2% of capability out of all the renewables, and that's just not at a time when our demand is at a peak. And so there's a whole range there of costings. And so I just take a weighted average. So I'm not saying how much of one versus the other, but I'm just saying the total has to come up to something like £2 million per megawatt, the capital cost for this, for a mixture of offshore and onshore wind, so much for solar and so much for nuclear, and an estimated cost of about 500 billion. So when we go back, we've got 500 billion there for the generation, 200 billion there for the transmission, and another 700 billion there. So we quickly get up to £2 trillion roughly, just to do the thing. So before I go further on that, I just want to take a sidestep on energy storage, because this is a place where almost everybody is speaking through their backside. I mean, some of the things they say are just amazing. So in this country, the largest pump storage is a place called Dinnervig in Wales. And it has 9 gigawatt hours capacity if you run the whole lake, whole water from up down below. You can generate 9 gigawatt hours. That is enough to charge up about 0.7% of the UK car fleet. If all the batteries are small, that's just 60 kilowatt hour batteries. And it would run the whole UK for about 10 minutes in winter and 15 minutes in summer. That's just taking this whole lake and running it down. Now, of course, we can't run it down again until we've generated excess energy to pump all the water back again. So this is a one shot, which means it shows you that it's on the scale to be not worth even considering in the scale of pictures. Now, I had an interesting discussion a couple of years ago with somebody from an organization we have here, which I think you have there, called Extinction Rebellion. And this person was quite convinced that all the backup electricity in hospitals in the United Kingdom would be provided by batteries by 2025. So I went home and rang up a hospital. We have a large teaching hospital with 1,000 beds called Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge. And I rang up the facilities manager and said, if I take the Elon Musk battery, which had a capacity of 100, power rating of 100 megawatts and an energy rating of 130 megawatt hours, if I put that outside Addenbrooke's, what could you use it for? And he said, well, if we take the 30% of the hospital that has emergency wards where they must have an uninterrupted power supply, that battery on a single 80% to 20% discharge would run the hospital for 24 hours. Now, at the moment, what they have is 2 diesel generators, which together cost £250,000. So the ratio of, if we had a day's outage, the ratio of the capital cost to provide backup is the ratio between 45 million and £250,000, which is 180 to 1. Now, just this last winter, we had a storm which took out the power supply of a part of the north of England, a relatively small part, but even so, it was out for a week. So if Addenbrooke's Hospital was out for a week, the capital cost ratio is 1,300 to 1. Now, no engineer with any ounce of professional integrity would recommend investing with those odds. And so this costing also applies to bigger places. When people say, well, what about the City of London? It's the biggest wheeling dealing place in the world. There's vast sums of money. But even at London, trying to run the City of London on this extra cost is just way off. So batteries, as we know them, are not going to play a role at, say, the 1% level by 2050.
There's this dream that everybody has EVs and they park their EV in the garage overnight, and all those batteries can be used by the grid as a wonderful backup power source. What do you think of that idea?
Well, it's good in theory. It runs into problems when you look at the reality. The point is that the peak demand is in winter, and people will not want to come out at 5 o'clock in the morning when they suddenly find that there's been a huge snowstorm and they've got to get to work or get somebody off to somebody, go and rescue somebody from the airport, and find that they only have 25% left in their tank. Everybody who's an emergency worker of any kind or anybody who has childcare responsibilities or anything, this is just not on. And indeed, I had a more interesting thing I read on the internet the other day of imagining that Florida 3 weeks ago was an all-electric place. What would happen when all these cars that are crawling along trying to get away can't afford to use sat-nav or any form of air conditioning or anything else because they run their batteries flat. Once their battery's flat, they're stationary. And there's no infrastructure anywhere near there. So I think anybody who is tempted to think about that domestic, it works in theory, but in practice, there are so many reasons why it probably won't happen. And indeed, there's a recent advisory that insurance companies don't want to cover the charging of batteries inside garages that are inside houses, because if there's a fire, their call-in for fire damages could be too high. So there's a whole series of related arguments there. This is the point I want to make here. This is just the energy storage in various mediums in megajoules per kilogram. And you notice halfway through here, we've got petrol at 50 megajoules per kilogram compared with, hydro at 0.72, lead acid further down, and then hydrogen is up higher by a factor of 3, but there are some problems with that, and then nuclear fission and fusion. So it's pretty clear why these probably represent the future if we can tame the nuclear fusion. And it'll be interesting to see how the new generation of nuclear fission, small modular reactors get on. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time now on housing. This is a bit in building stock. This is something I had a personal involvement in 12 years ago. Most of the winter heat in the UK is for heating buildings, both domestic and commercial. I was the chief scientific advisor for a department called Communities and Local Government. And I briefed the science minister at the time, Lord Drayson, on the need to retrofit existing buildings, reduce the 45% of UK emissions that come from buildings. And well, I've seen a spelling mistake there. He asked me, what should I do given the scale? And I said, we should have a pilot project. So this became a £17 million project that ran from 2010. God, there's another mistake here. I have to go through 2010 to 2013. We're over 100 social houses. These are houses that are slightly smaller than average that are available for rent. Were subject to various retrofit measures. In particular, there was a collection of 45 houses, which all had what they called a whole house retrofit. They just went in and they did external, internal insulation of walls, underfloor and loft insulation, double and treble glazing, new, more efficient appliances, etc., targeting at that time an 80% reduction. That was the target, and they designed this, went in. But for an average spend of £85,000, i.e. about $100,000 per house, the average reduction in those 45 was only 60% reduction in carbon emissions, with only 3 out of the 45 meeting the 80% target, and another 3 out of the 45 not even getting a 30% reduction. Now, the first thing to say is this was an experimental program, and every project was a one-off. But one of the major expenses of this is just the labor of installing all of these things. And that scales up. There's a certain amount of, if we roll this out as a national program, then the cost will probably come down by a factor of 2, but not a lot more than 2. And furthermore, this was 85,000 pounds giving 60% reduction. That's about 150,000 to get 100% reduction, which is what we're after. So you then get, if we did that whole thing on an experimental basis, it would cost about £4 trillion, i.e. twice as much as what we needed for the grid. And of course, there'll be, if there was a competitive retrofit sector with efficient supply chains, learning by doing, we'll probably get that down to 2 trillion or maybe even a bit less. But each house will require a bespoke, its own special solution, because poor cladding is worse than no cladding. If you leave gaps anywhere, you can get air bridges, thermal bridges, which make matters worse. It's particularly bad in roof spaces, where if you have uneven temperatures across the bottom in a roof, you can start convection currents in the roof space, and that's far more efficient at moving heat away than conduction. And so similarly there we've got 5.5 million, compared with 26 million households, we have 5.5 million non-domestic buildings and so on. And so this is the size of the problem we're dealing with. So the identified costs I've got for these, that's the replacement of the grid and improving the housing stock, is of order £4 trillion. That's without electric cars or any of the infrastructure for that. Now, money is one thing. There's another thing which nobody has given serious consideration to, and it really worries me. I asked Atkins, the same people, I said, if I've got a £1 billion contract to put in some energy, electricity infrastructure, you know, a new transmission line, a lot of domestic, urban distribution, what does that mean in terms of person years of professional engineering time and skilled trades time? And the answer, he said, it's about 1,000 years. And that, so if you now take the 1.4 trillion associated up here with the grid that we saw earlier on, then we need 42,000 electrical engineers for 30 years just to deliver those electrical projects. Well, it turns out we only have 38,000 electrical engineers in the UK or at the moment, and we would have to train this extra lot up, dedicated for 30 years from scratch. And by the time you take somebody who in their last year or second or third last year at school, convince them to be an engineer, take them all the way through to their degree and their professional qualification so that they can sign off professionally the design of something, that's at least 10 years. So we suddenly say we can't do this over 30 years. We're going to have to peak it up even more and do it in the last 20 years. So that's just for the electrical bit. For the retrofit, it's interesting. I've talked to a number of people here. You need a range of skills from semi-skilled to highly professional. And the size of that workforce to do that work is comparable, is of order 500,000 people working full-time for 30 years. And that gets up to something like the education sector is about that size, and the health sector is a bit more. So we're talking about a major perturbation on the structure of the workforce. So just at the moment, there's everybody saying, hang on, we've got to do a lot of insulation in houses to save us from this winter. We don't have enough people to do even 1% of the work. So there's a huge gap there in manpower. Now, the last bit is the bill of materials. And I want to just emphasize just how bad this is. Because as we go towards renewable energy, we're going to go from an energy transition from one where our present system is fossil fuel intensive, and we're going to one which is materials intensive. And I'll show you how. A 600 megawatt combined cycle gas turbine from Siemens comprises 300 tons of high performance steel and some other bits of material, but that's the most of it. Now, for 60, that will run for 60 years if we give it a one midlife retrofit. You know, so these things, after about 40 years, you just upgrade it and it'll go for another 20. But if you want to get 600 megawatts for 60 years, you would, to get the same amount of energy at any one time, you need 365 megawatt turbines running at 33% efficiency and a huge storage facility, which I haven't even considered yet, of batteries or whatever to store that. Okay, and because that's 360, because they only last 30 years, and we need 720 of these. Now, the other problem gets even worse than that. The mass of one nacelle in a one turbine is comparable to it's 250, 300 tons itself of high quality materials. And the concrete for one plinth, which is about 12 tons of steel and 300 of concrete, is equal or less than the material needed in the plinth of each of those 360, the foundations of each of those 360, 720 indeed, wind turbines. So we're talking about factors approaching 1,000. Now, a couple of things about this. If I was a lecturer giving a course in materials science and technology, one of the first things in the first lecture will be a lesson: do not be profligate with the use of materials. They are precious things. Well, this is a classic example of profligacy. The amount of, I'll show you later on, the amount of cobalt and lithium and everything else that's needed is just enormous. And just for these wind turbines, these ratios of what you need in terms of concrete and steel are just factors of 1,000 different. Now, here's the numbers for the UK. If the UK vehicle fleet went electric tomorrow, we'd need, this is work from the National History Museum, we'd need over 200,000 tons of cobalt for the batteries and the engines. And this is about double the annual production of the world at the moment. We'd need 264,000 tons of lithium carbonate, 75% of the world's production, at least 720 tons of neodymium, nearly the entire world production, and 2 million tons of copper, more than a sixth of the world's production. Now, this is just for the UK, and UK is about 1% of the world, just over 1%, hitting up toward 2%. We need to convert 3 times the equivalent of the United Kingdom to 100, in order to get the whole world up to 2050. We wouldn't do it this way, but the effort, total effort, would be the equivalent of 3 UKs each year and every year. So you can see that we're going to need a 10-fold increase in the production of these materials. Now, that isn't something that's wound up overnight. So here are the figures, by the way, for the US. They could be out, and I'm going to get somebody to double check them. But the cost of the grid expansion is about $12 trillion, or about $100,000 per household. The cost of the housing retrofit, I did an estimate, and then somebody did an estimate in the US where they divided the country into 6 zones with different climates. You know, clearly what you need to do in Chicago is not the same as what you need to do in Los Angeles. But they took 6 regions and then looked at them, and they came up with a figure of 22 trillion. I came up, I think, with 20 trillion. So it's of that order. The important thing is that it's not 6 trillion and it's not 60 trillion, it's about 20. The extra professionals, you need about 500,000 more electrical engineers with the 400 for 30 years. And then the battery are eye-watering numbers. Now, that's the main part of the cost of these 3 big energy projects. But there's context in which this is all done, because you could say, well, I'm going to take these numbers and I'm going to argue the case for these 3 projects to go on. But here's the problem you'll come up against. The data on the left is from British Petroleum, and the data on the right is from the World Bank. The one on the left is just the total consumption of energy, starting from coal, oil, gas, nuclear, hydro, and renewables at the top there. And on the right, and that's from 1965 to 2035, so right up to 2020 is hard data, and this is their best extrapolation. On the right here is the world population going from 6 to 8 trillion between 2000 and 2035. Now, the brown is the poor, that's the fraction of the world that's poor, and the green is the fraction that's middle class. Now, middle class is not what Americans will call middle class. Well, there is middle class in America, but this doesn't mean you have your own car but I mean, typically think of people living on the 33rd floor of an apartment block in Beijing or something like that. That will be middle class, where they have energy for electricity for heat, for communications, for cooking, and for getting up and down in a lift. Now, the most important thing from the World Bank is that there is the growth of the middle class. This curve, the green, and by about 2050, there'll be no, on this base, there'll be no middle class, there'll be no poor people, everybody will be middle class. And that, of course, is the first and the second of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, to eliminate world poverty and world hunger. So that's a sign we're on a trajectory to do that. Now, here I'm going to make one assumption. If the person who's living on the 30th floor of a high-rise building in a city in China uses about 3.5 times as much energy per person per day as that person did before when they were either in an urban slum or in a rural hovel, if it's the ratio of their energy use is 3.5 to 1, I can account for this curve here since 1980. I can attribute all the world's increase to the rise of the middle class. And the energy consumption per person in the US and in the UK and in Europe is actually pretty static. I think it's coming down slowly as we get slightly more energy efficient. But all this growth is in association with attaining the first and second of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm prepared to bet my whole inheritance, or what I leave to everybody else, that indeed that curve will carry on like that. We're not going to stop poor people raising their aspirations. So that's the context in which we're doing this. Here's another curve, which shows in red-brown the total amount of energy used in the world since about 1880, all the way through, extrapolated, dashed, up to 2050. And the one underneath it in blue is the contribution of all the energy coming from fossil fuels over that period. And about now, it's 82% of all the world energy comes from fossil fuels. And it's diverging and has been diverging for a bit. And that's because of all the renewables. The implication is that fossil fuels will still be 79% of the energy mix in 2050, because although we've had a big growth in renewables, the fossil fuels have been growing at 7 times that rate in terms of gigawatts over the last 20 years. In particular, there's no sign of a downturn of this blue curve to 0. And that's what is implied by a net zero economy. So the next question in all of this is not an engineering problem. It's a question of public acceptance. And there's an enormous amount of debate on this, but the Climate Change Committee in the United Kingdom claims that the cost of the energy transition will be about 1% of GDP. My estimate is more like 7%, comparable with the education budget. The figure is well in excess of £100,000 per household. And at the current energy costs, although our energy costs are going up rapidly as we speak, this was 50 years to recover, but our energy costs have just doubled. So that's still 25 years to recover the cost, even as it's doubled. And that's far longer than most people. 25 years is the sort of payback time for civil infrastructure, not personal consumption. If the US, UK, and Europe were to pay for the world's decarbonization, saying that they were great, the figure raises by another factor of 5. So if somehow global equity says we've got to pay for India and China and everybody else to get up to where we were, that figure comes up to £500,000, more than $500,000 per household. Now, I could give a whole lecture on this, but climate change adaptation is a much more sensible ask than climate mitigation. And I use an example in the UK, and I'd be really interested to know, there must be a United States example of what's called the Thames Barrier in London. This is a barrier, adjustable barrier over the River Thames in London. And when there's a threat of a flood in London, the barrier goes up. Now, that barrier was built in the 1980s. Why? Well, in the 1950s, there was a huge storm north of London, in the East Coast. Two villages went out to sea and 300 people died. And everybody realized that if that storm had been 100 miles further south, there would have been major floods in London caused by the Thames running up. And so they started detailed calculations then. And the calculation was, when should we build a barrier at considerable expense across the river so that during its design lifetime, the chances are 100% that it will save the cost of insurance claims equal to the cost of building it, so that instead of in future paying insurance claims for floods, we'll pay up front and we'll have a barrier and no. And the answer was somewhere in the 80s, so they built it. There's already similar calculations going on as to when they need to put another meter higher on the barrier. The problem in east of London is not only sea level rise, but the actual ground is sinking. It's actually sinking twice as fast as the sea's coming up. So the Thames Barrier was built and lots of other things we need to do. There's a big problem discussed in Wellington, which is a harbour city, not unlike San Francisco. And people say we're going to have to abandon Wellington if the sea level rises. Well, that's a load of nonsense, because Wellington is a much steeper city than Chicago, than San Francisco. And so even if the sea rose 5 meters, you would only take a 10-meter strip off around the coast and start again. And there's already a cycleway being designed, 68 kilometers long, from one end of the heads all the way through the inner harbour, around the city and out to the other heads. Now, if I took 1 meter wide of that and built a 5-meter high wall, it would only cost about $300 million US. Well, you wouldn't abandon the capital city with over 1 million people in it for just $300 million. So, and furthermore, you wouldn't have to build this whole barrier, the whole concrete wall now. There's only bits of it where it's at threat, and then you put a meter on here and a meter on there as and when you need it. So you only spend. Now, of course, the thing in the UK and New Zealand is that there's a major threat from earthquakes. And for 50 years now, 60 years, even more, there is a major state insurance policy that's managed for making major billion-dollar calls when earthquakes come along. And everybody's quite happy to pay a surcharge on their domestic insurance, because they know statistically that one day they might be claiming on it. And so, but I think that a climate change adaptation could be handled in the same way. We could say, look, this is where the sea levels might rise, or this is where we might get dry. Why don't we put a bit of a surcharge on our, and if it was modest enough, people wouldn't worry about it. And if they saw it being managed properly, they would also be keen on it. So just a few things to finish off. The spend profile won't be constant for 30 years because most of the first decade would have to be spent getting the skilled workforce. So we'd have to do it all in 20 years from 1930 onwards. The financing will be beyond the scope of the private sector. We have the biggest infrastructure program at the moment is a high-speed railway line going from London to Birmingham further north. That's just over $100 billion. We're going to have one of those each and every year for 30 years. The roadmap is essential. This is an important point, having come from the electronics sector. I assert that the most successful societal revolution in the last 40 years has been provided by information technology. Look at where we were in 1970, and now we're in a completely different place. That whole thing was underpinned by something called the International Technology Roadmap for Semiconductors, started in about 1980 and still goes on in a slightly modified form. What happened there is that the entire sector, representatives of the entire sector got together every 2 years for detailed workshops. And they said, we're going to keep Moore's law on track. We're going to keep that progress we've been seeing going. And therefore, in 6 years' time, in our factories will need equipment doing this. Therefore, in 12 years' time, that capability had better be in development. And so they looked out further to see what had to be ready to come out of the development into the production line, what had to come out of research into development, and what research should be done further down the line. So that everybody in the IT sector for the last 40 years has gone into work every day knowing that they're part of a much bigger enterprise, and there's lots of other people investing on their left-hand side and their right-hand side before them, behind them. And so everybody does something. Now, I claim that net zero is far more complicated a change in society than the IT revolution. And we're certainly not going to succeed unless everybody knows what it is they're supposed to be doing tomorrow to get there. And there's total absence of anything like that. And so I then asked the following question: what happens if we get cold feet in about 10 years' time? If people start and look and say, you know, cars don't do this, you know, we're going to have another resurgence of fossil fuel over the next few months, I think, to get us through winter. But what happens in 10 years' time if everybody says, I mean, suppose the climate scientists look and say, well, look, you know, for the last 30 years, we've been over-egging the problem. Suppose we now say, look, we've decided to have a really sober look, and things don't look quite as bad as we thought they'd be. There could be a problem, but not for 60 years' time. And therefore, nothing you're going to do now is going to pay money back. Could you imagine that? I mean, I could imagine a small group of them saying that. But the point is their whole business model would collapse. Their research funds would dry up tomorrow, and all their postdocs would be out of a job. So it's not likely to happen. But I keep saying that, you know, these 30-year civil engineering projects are ones that you have to be certain at the other end. So here's my practical alternative. The present rush to 2050 is going to cause more problems than it solves. The projections are over pessimistic in terms of the climate RC 8.5. All of the discussions are all, over 50% of all the discussions are couched in terms of 8.5 scenario, which we know is way too pessimistic. And then when it comes to adapting, I keep reminding people that the Dutch have been adapting for centuries. You know, the whole of the Netherlands is underwater. So my personal view is that net zero is an unattainable pipe dream without a major national commitment, a command economy, that is, you do what you're told as in wartime, and lower standards of living at the end. There's no democratic debate on the whole of net zero based on the essential data. I think the Net Zero Act should be repealed. I mean, we have it in legislation, and replaced with a more realistic target. And my final point is this one. The academies, that's the Royal Society and Royal Academy of Engineering in this country, but the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering in the US, have been absent in the debate in the way I've framed it. They're all very interesting, a little bit here and a little bit there, but when they look at integrating the whole picture, they will not go there because they know it's horrific. And that's it.
Okay, I think that was absolutely fantastic. I loved all of the seeing all that data. So that was one of the best presentations I've ever seen.
Well, really? Well, thanks.
It really was.
That's, yeah, well, that's what I'm, and then there's a whole series of references here for anybody who wants it.
Any other points you'd like to make?
No, those are the ones that are on the, so I've got to the stage recently where I have not been arguing with the climate scientists about climate science. But some people are telling me I've got to go back in there because they're getting a free ride. My personal view is that climate change is real, never thought it was other than that, and that some of it is done by mankind, but the idea that it's an imminent global catastrophe is just not borne out by the data. And that I think this mad rush to net zero is going to cause more problems for the world and leave more people in poverty than if we had business as usual. Now, when people talk about energy efficiency, my point is that energy efficiency has been a major feature of work for the last 150 years. Now, it's certainly true that in the mid-20th century, when energy was particularly cheap, it wasn't necessarily to the fore. But in this day and age of competition, if you can shave 10% off your energy use, that's pure profit. My email, I think, is on the front slide. You've got it anyway. I need somebody to help me with the US paper. I've got it written. I could give it to them. But I want to know what's the equivalent of Dinnervig. What's the biggest pump storage in the US now? And what's the size of one of the major hospitals, an iconic hospital in New York? Is it 1,000? If it's 1,000 beds, then that's roughly the scale. If it's a teaching hospital, 1,000 beds, I need something of that scale. So instead of referring back to Cambridge Hospital, I can even one in Cambridge, Massachusetts would be better. By the way, there's also some of the stuff I've written is listed here. It's all available on the web.
Okay, I will look that up. All right, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
By the way, just one thing, I'll just having a look. There's just a couple of lines of slides afterwards. These are just ones if I'm ever asked. You may or may not choose to include them. But this is one of my favorite ones from the lecture I gave a few years ago. This black line here is the increase in carbon emissions, and it has kept going up recently. And this is what has to be done to get to net zero. And I say we need herds of unicorns.
Very good.
Okay.
All right, all set?
Fine.
All
yes,
right.
certainly.
Thank you very much. And we'll talk to you
Fine.
next time.
Let me know when it's up.
All right, I will let you know.